This screencast is going to talk about percents, what percents are, and then how you would convert between a percent to a decimal or a percent to a fraction. So talking about percents, we want to look at the definition for a percent, and a percent means out of 100. So anytime we say like 81%, we're talking about 81 out of 100. Okay? Or if we talk about 12.2%, we're talking about 12.2 out of 100. So for every 100, it would be 12.2. So let's take a look at converting between or changing between a percent and a fraction. So let's go ahead and start with our percents. We have 98%, 12%, and then 15.1%. Even though this last number has a decimal in it, we're going to talk about why it's still not considered a decimal number. So when we look at 98%, we want to think about the fact that percent means out of 100. So we're going to take the number that we have and we're going to write that as our numerator, our top number, over 100. Now, both of these are even numbers, so we are going to have to simplify this fraction into its simplest form. This 98 over 100 is not technically your final answer. So let's go ahead and simplify that answer. So we can divide both numbers by 2 because they're even, and that would get us 49 over 50. And this would be our final fraction answer. So 98% is equal to 49/50ths, or 98 over 100. So let's take a look at 12%. Once again, we're going to write this as 12 over 100 because it's 12 out of 100. Both numbers are even, so we can divide by 2. Divide by 2, we would get 6/50ths. Once again, both numbers are even, so let's just keep dividing by 2. So that would become 3/25ths, and this would be our simplest form. So 12% is equal to 3/25ths. Last example looks a little different, so we're looking at 15.1%. In this case, we're going to write 15.1 over 100, and that's okay to have that decimal in the top number. If it makes you feel a little weird, you could write this over 1,000, and it would become 151 over 1,000. And the reason why that's okay is because when you add that 0 to the 100, you're technically multiplying by 10. When you multiply 15.1 by 10, you're moving that decimal point over one space, which gets you to 151. Now let's take a look at changing fractions to percents. So if we're looking at the fraction 3/5, think back to when we talked about changing fractions to decimals. 5 can be changed into a denominator of 10. So I'm going to look at this as being changing 5 to 10. So how would I do that? I would multiply by 2. So I have to multiply 3 times 2. That would get me to 6. 6/10 is still just 6/10. Remember that percent means out of 100. So can I change 10 into 100? Yes. So I'm going to multiply by 10, and I'm going to also multiply 6 by 10. This is going to get me to 60 over 100. 60 out of 100. So that means that my percent for this particular fraction is 60%. So 3/5 is equal to 60%. Now, not all fractions are going to be that nice. So 1/6 cannot be multiplied. 6 cannot be multiplied by anything to get to 100. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to change that into a decimal and then change our decimal into a percent. So this is just going to review changing fractions to decimals. Remember, we put the numerator inside, put the denominator outside. We add our decimal and our 0, bring our decimal point up, and then we start dividing. 6 goes into 10 one time, we get 6. Subtract, that gives us a 4. We add a 0, bring it down, we get 40. And 6 goes into 40 6 times. 6 times 6 is 36. We subtract. We get a 4. Add another 0. Bring that down. We get another 6. So that's going to tell me that my decimal is equal to 0.16 repeating. When I go to change a decimal to a percent, I am actually multiplying it by 100, but the shortcut is to move the decimal point 2 spaces to the right. So my percent would be 16%. And if you want, you could put 16.6 repeating percent, but that's up to you. So that would be your percent. That's moving the decimal point 2 spaces to the right. So if we look at one other example where we're just changing a decimal, so if I give you a decimal such as 0.25, you would multiply that by 100, which is really moving the decimal point 2 spaces to the right, which would give you 25%. So now it's your turn. So I want you to practice. So pause the video, change your percents into fractions, and change your fractions into percents. So go ahead and try, and then once you're finished, go ahead and hit play and check your answer. So if you take a look at the answers, you'll see we get 79 hundredths, 3 50ths, 3.1 over 100 or 31 over 1,000. 4 fifths becomes 8 tenths, which becomes 80 over 100, which becomes 80%. And then 5 eighths is a decimal of 0.625. You move your decimal point over 2 spaces. Even if there's still a number there, you would just put 0.5, so it would be 62.5%. So let's take a look at changing percents to decimals. So once again, we know that 16% or percent means out of 100. So we are going to change this percent into a fraction first. So we're going to have 16 over 100. Remember we were talking about changing from fractions to decimals. If you have a fraction that has 10 or 100 or 1,000 as the denominator, you should be able to easily change that into a decimal. If you can say the fraction, you can write the decimal. So you have 16 hundredths. So think about, you have your decimal point, and then you would put your 16 because that 6 has to go in the hundredths place. Let's take a look at 151%. This would be 151 over 100. When I'm writing this as a decimal, remember I'm putting, if it's 151 over 100, that's greater than 100. So this is going to have to be 1 whole and then 0.51. So it's really 151 hundredths. So 1 and 51 hundredths would be your decimal. And then finally, for our last percent, we would put 12.2 over 100. And then we would change this. So it would be 12.2 over 100. Technically, what we're doing is moving the decimal point 2 spaces to the left. So it would be 0.122 would be your decimal. Same thing here. Here's your decimal point. 2 spaces in would be 1.51. If you're looking at your decimals already, all you're doing is you're taking the decimal point and you're moving it 2 spaces to the right. So this would become 12%. And we looked at this back here with our 1/6, changing it to a decimal and then changing it to a percent. So if we take a look at 0.6, we're going to move the decimal point 2 spaces to the right, and then we're going to put a 0 behind the 60 to make 60%. So you're going to fill in that space. Last problem, 1.23, move it 2 spaces to the right, would become 123%. So now it's your turn. Change each percent to a decimal and each decimal to a percent. Pause the video and then hit play once you think you have your answers. Here are your answers. Go ahead and check your answers with mine. Remember that you're moving your decimal point 2 spaces to the left. Here's my decimal point in 125%. 2 spaces to the left would be 1.25. When you're looking at decimals, you're moving it 2 spaces to the right, and then you're adding zeros if you need to, and those are why those answers make sense. We're also going to look at using a calculator to go from fractions to percents, percents to fractions, percents to decimals, and then decimals to percents. But we'll talk about that in class. So if you want, you can write down these steps, but we'll also review this in class as well. So just to review, percents mean out of 100, and you can convert between fractions, decimals, and percents.